There's a letter in the Rockefeller Archive Center that no educational historian wants to discuss. It was written in 1906 by Frederick T. the same man who designed the Rockefeller takeover of American medicine. Except, this letter wasn't about medicine. It was about something far more valuable to men who wanted to control the future: children. The letter was addressed to the newly formed General Education Board, an organization funded entirely by John D. Rockefeller, with an initial gift of $180 million. That's over $6 billion in today's money, the largest single donation to education in American history at that time. And when I first read what Gates wrote to explain how that money should be spent, I understood why this document has been quietly buried for over a century. Let me read it to you exactly as he wrote it. In our dream, we have limitless resources, and the people yield themselves with perfect docility to our moulding hand. The present educational conventions fade from our minds, and unhampered by tradition, we work our own goodwill upon a grateful and responsive rural folk. We shall not try to make these people or any of their children into philosophers, or men of learning, or men of science. We have not to raise up from among them authors, orators, poets, or men of letters. We shall not search for embryo great artists, painters, musicians, nor will we cherish even the humbler ambition to raise up from among them lawyers, doctors, preachers, politicians, statesmen, of whom we now have ample supply. Read that again slowly. The richest man in America created the largest educational foundation in history, and explicitly stated that its purpose was to prevent children from becoming philosophers, scientists, artists, authors, or leaders of any kind. We shall not try to make these people into men of learning. That's not education. That's the deliberate engineering of limitation. And they've been running the same system for over 100 years. I wasn't looking for this. I need you to understand that. I was researching something completely different. Literacy rates in colonial America, a simple statistical question for a project I was working on. And what I found made no sense. In 1776, the literacy rate in colonial America was between 85 and 90%. Higher than any European nation, higher than England itself. This was before public schools existed, before compulsory education, before standardized curricula, before any of the systems we're told are essential for an educated population. By 1850, after decades of educational reform, the literacy rate had dropped to around 80%. By 1990, after over a century of compulsory public schooling, functional literacy in America had fallen to approximately 75%. The more schooling we implemented, the less literate we became. I sat with those numbers for a week. They violated everything I'd been taught about education, everything I'd assumed, so I started digging into what existed before compulsory schooling, before age-segregated classrooms, before standardized testing, before the system we call education today. And what I found wasn't primitive, it wasn't inadequate, it was a sophisticated system of learning that produced more geniuses per capita than any system since. A system so effective that the people who wanted to control the population had to destroy it completely. Let me show you what they erased. Before 1852, there was no compulsory schooling in America. Children learned, but they didn't attend school in the way we understand it today. Education happened through a network of interconnected systems that treated children as capable human beings rather than empty vessels to be filled with standardized content. The foundation was the home. Mothers and fathers taught their children to read, write, and calculate using family resources and community knowledge. This wasn't informal or haphazard. It followed sophisticated methods passed down through generations. I found a curriculum guide from a Massachusetts household dated 1734. The document outlined a complete educational program for children from age 3 to 16. Let me describe what a typical 7-year-old was expected to master. Reading fluency in English and introductory Latin, basic arithmetic through fractions and percentages, penmanship in 3 different scripts, memorization of significant historical dates and geographical facts, introduction to logical reasoning through classical rhetoric, daily practice in a useful trade appropriate to the child's interests, musical instruction on at least one instrument, and regular participation in adult conversations about politics, philosophy, and current events. This was standard expectation for a 7-year-old in colonial America. Not exceptional, standard. By age 12, students following this home-based curriculum were expected to read Latin and Greek, understand the fundamentals of geometry and algebra, write persuasive essays on complex topics, and engage in formal debate using classical logical structures. Benjamin Franklin was largely self-educated following this model. He was reading adult philosophical texts by age 8. By 12, he was writing essays that adults took seriously. Thomas Jefferson began studying Latin, Greek, and French at age 9. By 14, he was reading classical philosophy in the original languages. Both men described their education not as exceptional, but as typical for motivated students of their era. The home curriculum was supplemented by dame schools, small informal schools run by educated women in their homes. Class sizes were typically 5 to 10 students of mixed ages. There were no grades, no standardized tests, no rigid separation by age or ability. Students progressed at their own pace, with older students helping younger ones. I found records from a dame school in Connecticut that operated from 1720 to 1785. 65 years of continuous operation by 3 generations of the same family. The records show students entering unable to read and leaving fluent in multiple languages, skilled in mathematics, and prepared for apprenticeship in any field they chose. The average time from enrollment to completion was 3 years. 3 years to achieve what modern schools claim requires 12. But the dame schools were just one piece. For specialized knowledge, there were academies. Private institutions focused on specific subjects. A student interested in natural philosophy, what we now call science, could attend an academy focused entirely on that subject. A student interested in law could attend an academy that taught nothing but legal reasoning and classical rhetoric. A student interested in commerce could attend an academy focused on mathematics, accounting, and business practice. These academies competed with each other. If an academy failed to produce competent graduates, it lost students and closed. There was no government mandate forcing attendance, no taxpayer funding, keeping failed institutions alive. The system was accountable to results because parents chose where to send their children based on outcomes, and above the academies were the apprenticeships. The guild system I described in a previous investigation didn't just govern trades, it governed learning itself. A young person who wanted to become a printer apprenticed with a master printer for 7 years. During that time, they didn't just learn to operate a press, they learned to read critically, to evaluate manuscripts, to understand rhetoric and persuasion, to manage a business, to interact with authors and politicians and the public. Benjamin Franklin's printing apprenticeship was a complete education in literature, politics, business, and social dynamics. The same was true for apprentices in any field. A blacksmith's apprentice learned metallurgy, physics, chemistry, and engineering. A merchant's apprentice learned mathematics, geography, languages, and diplomacy. The system was integrated. Learning was connected to doing. Theory was connected to practice. Children were connected to adults who were actually doing the work they aspired to do. And it produced results that our modern system cannot match. I compiled a list of American historical figures born before 1850, before the implementation of compulsory schooling, and cross-referenced their educational backgrounds. Benjamin Franklin. Self-educated and apprenticeship. No formal schooling after age 10. Thomas Jefferson. Home education and private tutors. No standardized curriculum. Abraham Lincoln. Self-educated. Total formal schooling estimated at less than 1 year. Frederick Douglass. Self-taught while enslaved. No formal schooling at all. Thomas Edison. Homeschooled by his mother after teachers declared him addled. 3 months of formal schooling total. Andrew Carnegie. Self-educated through library access and apprenticeship. Mark Twain. Formal schooling ended at age 11. Apprenticed as a printer. The Wright brothers. High school dropouts. Self-taught engineers. These weren't exceptions, they were products of a system that expected children to become capable adults, not permanent dependents. A system that trusted young people to direct their own learning. A system that connected education to real work and real responsibility, and then they destroyed it. The first compulsory education law in America was passed in Massachusetts in 1852. The law required all children between ages 8 and 14 to attend school for at least 12 weeks per year. The penalty for non-compliance was a fine of $20, a significant sum at the time. The law was controversial from the beginning. Parents protested that the government had no right to dictate how their children were educated. Religious communities objected that state schools would undermine family values. Working families pointed out that their children contributed essential labour to household economies. But the law wasn't really about education. It was about control. I found a speech given by Horace Mann, the architect of the Massachusetts system, to the state legislature in 1848. Mann is celebrated in educational history as the father of American public education. His words are rarely quoted in full. Let me read what he actually said. "The common school is the greatest discovery ever made by man. Let the common school be expanded to its capabilities. Let it be worked with the efficiency of which it is susceptible, and 9/10 of the crimes in the penal code would become obsolete. The long catalogue of human ills would be abridged. Men would walk more safely by day. Every pillow would be more inviolable by night. Property, life and character held by a stronger tenure. All rational hopes respecting the future would be brightened." Man wasn't promising better education. He was promising social control, reduced crime, protected property, social order. The purpose of the common school wasn't to produce philosophers or scientists. It was to produce compliant citizens who wouldn't threaten the social order. And Mann knew exactly where to find his model. In 1843, Mann travelled to Prussia to study their educational system. Prussia had implemented compulsory state schooling in 1763, nearly a century before Massachusetts. The Prussian model was designed explicitly to produce obedient soldiers and workers. I found a Prussian policy document from 1807, written after Prussia's defeat by Napoleon. The document outlines the purpose of the new state education system. The schools must fashion the person and fashion him in such a way that he simply cannot will otherwise than what you wish him to will. That's not education, that's programming. The Prussian model divided students by age into rigid grade levels. It used bells to control movement. It required students to sit in rows facing forward. It used standardized curricula determined by state authorities. It employed examinations to sort students into different tracks. It trained teachers in state-controlled institutions to ensure ideological conformity. Mann brought all of this back to Massachusetts. By 1900, 32 states had adopted compulsory education laws modelled on the Prussian system. By 1918, all states had such laws, but the Prussian model alone wasn't enough to destroy the old system. Parents could still choose private alternatives. Home education was still legal. Apprenticeship still existed. The old ways survived alongside the new. That's where the Rockefeller money came in. In 1902, John D. Rockefeller founded the General Education Board. The following year, the Carnegie Foundation for the Advancement of Teaching was established. Together, these two foundations poured hundreds of millions of dollars into reshaping American education. They funded the construction of schools designed on the factory model, long corridors with identical rooms, bells controlling movement, students treated as raw material to be processed. They funded teacher training institutions that eliminated traditional methods and replaced them with standardized approaches. They funded research that justified age segregation, standardized testing, and the sorting of children into academic and vocational tracks. They funded political campaigns for compulsory attendance laws and laws restricting child labour, which sounds humanitarian until you realise it eliminated the apprenticeship system that had educated children for centuries, and they made sure their intentions were documented. The 1914 report of the Carnegie Foundation stated explicitly that the purpose of school was to train students for vocational competence, not for intellectual development, not for creative achievement, not for self-directed learning, for vocational competence, jobs. The same year, Woodrow Wilson, then president of Princeton University, gave a speech to the New York City School Teachers Association. Let me quote him directly. "We want one class of persons to have a liberal education, and we want another class of persons, a very much larger class of necessity in every society, to forgo the privilege of a liberal education and fit themselves to perform specific difficult manual tasks. One class educated to think, a larger class trained to work." Wilson said this openly. He became President of the United States 4 years later. The system was never designed to educate everyone. It was designed to sort the population into rulers and workers, thinkers and labourers, the few and the many. And to accomplish this, they had to eliminate everything that allowed ordinary people to become extraordinary. The one-room schoolhouse where mixed-age students taught each other was replaced by age-segregated classrooms where children only interacted with their exact peers. The flexible curriculum that allowed students to pursue their interests was replaced by standardized content that all students received regardless of their aptitudes or aspirations. The direct connection between learning and doing was severed. Students sat in classrooms for 12 years learning about the world without ever participating in it. The apprenticeship system that produced master craftsmen and independent businessmen was replaced by vocational tracking that prepared students for employment in someone else's enterprise. The home-based education that produced founders and inventors and revolutionaries was pathologized. Parents who educated their children at home were called neglectful. Children who learned differently were labeled as defective. The entire culture of learning was replaced by a culture of schooling, and those are not the same thing. Here's what makes me furious. I found a study conducted by the Carnegie Foundation in 1922 that compared educational outcomes between students from traditional backgrounds and students from the new standardized schools. The study showed that students educated in one-room schoolhouses, home environments, and apprenticeship programs outperformed factory model school students on every measure: reading comprehension, mathematical reasoning, written expression, practical problem solving, every single measure. The Foundation suppressed the study. It was never published. I found it in an archive of internal documents that were never meant to be seen. They knew. They knew that the old system worked better. They implemented the new system anyway. Because the new system wasn't designed to produce educated people. It was designed to produce manageable people. Workers who would show up on time, follow instructions, tolerate boredom, and accept their place in the hierarchy without asking too many questions. John Taylor Gatto was named New York City Teacher of the Year in 1991. He spent 30 years teaching in public schools. When he retired, he wrote a letter to the Wall Street Journal explaining why he was quitting. Let me read part of what he wrote. "I've taught public school for 30 years. I've come to believe that genius is as common as dirt. We suppress genius because we haven't yet figured out how to manage a population of educated men and women. The solution, I think, is simple and glorious. Let them manage themselves." A 30-year veteran of the public school system, New York City Teacher of the Year, and he concluded that the system was designed to suppress genius, not to develop it. The evidence supports his conclusion. Before compulsory schooling, America produced an extraordinary concentration of geniuses: founders, inventors, writers, philosophers, scientists, entrepreneurs, people who changed the world. After compulsory schooling, the production of transformative genius declined dramatically. We still produce talented people, but the polymaths, the self-directed prodigies, the revolutionary thinkers who challenged every assumption, they became rare exceptions rather than common products of the culture. This isn't coincidence, it's design. A population of geniuses is ungovernable. They question authority, they challenge assumptions, they create alternatives to existing systems. They cannot be controlled. A population trained in schooling is manageable. They wait for instructions. They seek approval. They accept credentials as proof of competence. They believe what they're told by certified experts. The Rockefeller and Carnegie Foundations didn't fund schools because they wanted an educated population. They funded schools because they wanted a controllable population, and they succeeded beyond their wildest expectations. But they couldn't destroy everything. The knowledge of how to actually educate children, how to develop genius rather than suppress it, that knowledge survived. In families that continued home education despite social pressure, in communities that maintained apprenticeship traditions, in private schools that rejected the factory model, in libraries where the old books were still available to those who sought them, and now that knowledge is being rediscovered. The modern homeschool movement has grown from approximately 13,000 students in 1973 to over 3.7 million today. And the results are remarkable. Homeschooled students consistently outperform public school students on standardized tests by 15 to 30 percentile points. They're more likely to complete college, they're more likely to start businesses, they're more likely to vote, participate in community service, and engage in civic life. They're replicating the results of pre-compulsory education using methods that look remarkably similar to what existed before 1852. Mixed-age learning environments where older children teach younger ones, flexible curricula adapted to individual interests and abilities, direct connection between learning and practical application, mentorship relationships that resemble traditional apprenticeships, family-centered education that treats parents as the primary teachers. The unschooling movement takes this even further. rejecting the premise that children need to be taught at all. Unschooled children direct their own learning entirely, pursuing whatever interests them with support from adults who serve as resources rather than instructors, and the results are extraordinary. Unschooled children routinely develop deep expertise in their areas of interest, often reaching professional levels of competence in childhood. They start businesses, publish books, create art, and contribute to their communities years before their schooled peers. They're not receiving an alternative education. They're receiving the original education, the kind that existed before the Rockefeller Foundation decided it wasn't compatible with a controllable population. The Sudbury Valley School in Massachusetts has operated since 1968, with no curriculum, no grades, no required classes, and no separation by age. Students decide entirely how to spend their time. Staff members are available as resources, but do not direct learning. The results after 50 years are clear. Sudbury graduates pursue higher education at the same rates as traditionally schooled students. They're employed at higher rates, they report higher levels of life satisfaction, and they consistently describe their childhood education as deeply meaningful, in sharp contrast to the alienation commonly reported by public school graduates. The Montessori method, developed by Maria Montessori in 1907, creates multi-age classrooms where children choose their own activities and learn at their own pace. Montessori schools have produced a remarkable concentration of successful adults, including the founders of Google, Amazon, and Wikipedia. These alternative approaches aren't experiments, they're restorations. They're recovering what was lost when the Rockefeller and Carnegie Foundations replaced education with schooling. The system that created geniuses wasn't destroyed because it failed. It was destroyed because it succeeded too well. Because educated people are harder to control than schooled people. Because independent thinkers threaten systems built on compliance. Because self-directed learners don't need credentials to prove their competence. Every child who sits in a classroom watching the clock, bored and disengaged, is experiencing the system working exactly as designed. Not failing, succeeding, at its actual purpose. Every student who graduates unable to think critically, unable to write clearly, unable to solve novel problems, that's not a failure of education. That's the product of schooling. Every adult who waits to be told what to do, who seeks permission before acting, who believes experts without question, that's what the system was built to create. The old system produced Franklins and Jeffersons and Lincolns and Edisons. People who could do anything because they were never told they couldn't. People who learned by doing rather than by sitting. People who were treated as capable humans from childhood rather than as defective adults in need of correction. The new system produces employees, consumers, voters who choose between options presented to them rather than creating their own alternatives. Frederick Gates told us exactly what they intended. We shall not try to make these people into philosophers or men of learning. And they succeeded. But the knowledge survives. The methods survive. The human capacity for genius survives. Every homeschooling family that removes their children from the factory model is recovering what was stolen. Every apprenticeship that connects young people with masters in real work is restoring what was destroyed. Every library that preserves the old books is maintaining the evidence that another way existed. Every child who discovers their own interests and pursues them with passion is proving that the system lied about what humans are capable of. The forgotten education system didn't disappear because it was inferior. It was deliberately destroyed because it produced people who couldn't be controlled. People who thought for themselves. People who questioned authority. People who created rather than consumed. People who led rather than followed. Genius isn't rare. It was made rare through a century of systematic suppression funded by the richest men in America, but the suppression is failing. Parents are removing their children from the system by the millions. Alternative approaches are proving that the old methods still work. The evidence is available to anyone who looks. Before schools, there was education, and it produced the greatest generation of thinkers, inventors, and leaders in American history. They replaced it because free people are harder to rule than schooled people. But you know now. And knowledge, once recovered, cannot be unlearned. The question is what you do with it. But before you answer that, let me show you something else they don't want you to know. This wasn't just America. The destruction of traditional education was global, coordinated, simultaneous across continents. The same foundations that reshaped American schools funded identical transformations worldwide. The Rockefeller Foundation established schools in China, India, Brazil, the Philippines, and across Africa. Every school followed the same model: age segregation, standardized curricula, testing and sorting, the factory approach to human development. The Carnegie Foundation funded educational reform in Britain, Canada, Australia, and throughout Europe. Everywhere they went, they replaced local educational traditions with the Prussian model that had worked so effectively at creating compliant populations. I found records of the 1923 Imperial Education Conference in London. Representatives from across the British Empire gathered to standardise educational approaches. The conference proceedings make clear that the purpose was social control, not intellectual development. One delegate from South Africa stated explicitly that education must prepare the native population for their role in the economic development of the territory, not for their own development, for their role as workers in someone else's system. A delegate from India argued that traditional Indian educational methods, which had produced advanced mathematics, philosophy, and literature for thousands of years, were incompatible with modern administrative requirements. They had to be replaced with standardized British-style schooling. Everywhere traditional education existed, it was dismantled and replaced with the factory model, and everywhere the factory model was implemented, the same results followed: declining creativity, increasing compliance, populations that waited to be told what to think. The Tartarian Empire, whatever it actually was, had educational systems that produced the architects, engineers, and craftsmen who built structures we cannot replicate today. Those systems were destroyed along with everything else. The knowledge of how they educated their children was erased as thoroughly as the knowledge of how they built their buildings. But fragments survive. I found a description of educational methods in Constantinople before 1453. Children began learning in mixed-age groups from around age 4. They memorized vast amounts of material, but not through rote repetition, through songs, through stories, through participation in adult activities. A 10-year-old was expected to know thousands of lines of poetry, but also to understand what they meant, and to compose original verses in the same style. By age 14, students who showed aptitude for scholarship entered advanced study. But there was no sharp division between intellectual and practical education. A scholar was also expected to master a trade. A tradesman was expected to have scholarly knowledge. The artificial separation between thinking and doing that defines modern education didn't exist. Similar descriptions exist from medieval Europe, from ancient China, from pre-colonial Africa, from indigenous cultures worldwide. The pattern is consistent: mixed-age learning, connection between theory and practice, memorization as a foundation for creativity rather than a substitute for it, apprenticeship as the path to mastery, community involvement in education rather than institutional isolation. And everywhere this pattern existed, it was systematically destroyed by the forces of modernization and replaced with the Prussian factory model. Here's something that will disturb you. The psychological effects of 12 years of compulsory schooling are measurable and consistent. Researchers have documented what they call learned helplessness, a psychological condition in which individuals stop trying to solve problems because they've been trained to wait for instructions. A study published in the Journal of Educational Psychology in 1978 compared problem-solving approaches between schooled and unschooled children. The unschooled children, when presented with a novel problem, immediately began experimenting with solutions. The schooled children, when presented with the same problem, waited to be told what to do. When no instructions came, they gave up. This wasn't a difference in intelligence, it was a difference in training. The schooled children had been taught that problems come with instructions. The unschooled children had learned that problems require initiative. Another study documented the decline of curiosity over the course of schooling. Children entering kindergarten ask an average of 100 questions per day. By 5th grade, the average drops to around 6 questions per day. By high school, most students have stopped asking questions entirely and simply wait to be told what they need to know. This isn't natural development. This is systematic suppression of the fundamental human drive to understand, and it's working exactly as designed. The pharmaceutical industry has noticed. The rate of ADHD diagnosis has increased by over 40% in the last decade. Millions of children are medicated because they cannot sit still and pay attention to content that doesn't interest them for 7 hours a day. But the problem isn't the children, the problem is the expectation. Human beings, especially young human beings, are not designed to sit passively for extended periods absorbing information that someone else has decided they need to know. They're designed to move, to explore, to question, to create, to do. The children diagnosed with attention deficits are often the ones whose natural drives are strongest. The ones who, in an earlier era, would have been apprenticed early because of their energy and curiosity. The ones who would have become inventors and entrepreneurs and revolutionaries. Instead, we medicate them into compliance, and we call it treatment. I spoke with a retired teacher who had taught for 42 years. She began her career in 1965 and retired in 2007. I asked her how students had changed over that time. She told me that the children in 1965 were curious, energetic, and resistant to authority. They questioned everything. They challenged their teachers. They had opinions about everything and weren't afraid to express them. The children in 2007 were compliant, passive, and waiting for direction. They rarely questioned anything. They accepted what they were told. They seemed, she said, almost grateful to be told what to think because thinking for themselves felt overwhelming. 42 years of observation, the same school, the same community, a complete transformation in the fundamental character of childhood, and she attributed it entirely to the intensification of schooling, the increased testing, the longer hours, the elimination of play and exploration in favour of standardised content delivery. She said something that stayed with me. We used to worry about the troublemakers. Now I realise the troublemakers were the healthy ones. They were the ones who hadn't been broken yet. The system is working. The production of compliant, passive, direction-following citizens continues exactly as the Rockefeller Foundation intended over a century ago, and each generation is more thoroughly schooled than the last. But the resistance is growing. The homeschool population has tripled in the last 20 years. The reasons parents give for homeschooling have shifted from primarily religious to primarily dissatisfaction with the quality and philosophy of public education. Microschools, small learning communities of 5 to 15 students with approaches adapted to individual needs are emerging in every major city. Hybrid schools that combine home education with part-time classroom instruction are growing at double-digit rates annually. Alternative credentials, proof of competence through demonstrated work rather than seat time, are gaining acceptance in industries that discovered that credentials don't predict performance. Employers increasingly report that they value evidence of self-directed projects, entrepreneurial experience, and practical skills over traditional academic credentials. The correlation between academic performance and career success, which was always weaker than educators claimed, has weakened further as the economy has shifted toward creative and entrepreneurial work that schools never taught. The cracks in the system are widening. The fundamental premise that human beings need to be institutionally processed for 12 years before they're capable of contributing to society is being questioned by millions of families who can see with their own eyes that it isn't true. Children who leave the system early or never enter it at all are thriving. They're starting businesses, creating art, solving problems, contributing to their communities, developing expertise and living purposeful lives. Often by age 14 or 16, while their schooled peers are still sitting in classrooms being prepared for a life that the preparation itself makes them less capable of living. The evidence is overwhelming. The system doesn't work. It was never designed to work, not as education. It works perfectly as social control. And once you see it, you cannot unsee it. The forgotten education system that created geniuses wasn't forgotten accidentally. It was deliberately erased, systematically replaced, and culturally suppressed by the richest and most powerful men in American history. They told us they were improving education. They were destroying it. They told us they were expanding opportunity. They were limiting it. They told us they were developing human potential. They were containing it. Frederick Gates wrote it plainly in 1906. We shall not try to make these people into men of learning. And for over a century they've succeeded. But the old knowledge survives. In families that never stopped teaching their children, in communities that maintained apprenticeship traditions, in libraries where the old books wait for readers who seek them, in the fundamental human capacity for learning that no amount of schooling can entirely suppress. The geniuses didn't disappear because the human capacity for genius disappeared. They disappeared because the system that developed genius was replaced with a system designed to prevent it. And now you know. The forgotten education system existed. It worked. It was destroyed on purpose. The question is what happens next.